everyone. Thank you, Michelle. So long before I joined FCLNY's board, their activism was quietly changing me from a feminist academic who was decidedly, if not vociferously, pro-choice into what I can only call an abortion doubter. I had had an abortion while doing my PhD in my mid-20s, but grew increasingly ambivalent about it once I experienced motherhood in my early 30s. As a feminist scholar, however, I had been firmly trained to believe that women's agency was predicated upon women's reproductive rights. In my mind, since a woman had to gestate and typically care for her baby after its birth, her choice trumped her baby's life. But about 5 years ago, FCLNY erected a billboard right off my highway exit, about half a mile from my home. And every day, no matter where I was going, I saw this monumental image of a pregnant woman's stomach being kissed by a man, whom I, of course, assumed to be the father of the baby, with the large words emblazoned upon it that said, "Women deserve better than abortion." I saw this every day for nearly a year, and my heart started to turn. By the following year, when former Governor Andrew Cuomo was ghoulishly lighting up the Empire State Building in pink, no less, to celebrate the erroneously named Reproductive Health Act, I had discovered that abortion was not quite the feminist freedom I had once believed it to be. After I made a few enraged posts regarding the horrors of late-term abortion on Facebook, the ladies of FCLNY found me, and I am forever grateful that they did. The umbrella title for the symposia, as Michelle said, is Reframing Agency, Feminist Perspectives. So I thought it would be useful to lay out what that term agency initially meant to feminist scholars and what it seems to mean now. Feminist scholars originally defined agency as how women living within a patriarchal society could fulfill their unique female needs while simultaneously critiquing the society that oppressed them. To have agency was to be an independent thinking agent, acting in and pushing back against the outside world. Some scholars said women gain agency through political activism with other feminists. Some said you did it by critiquing gender norms, and still others said it was through personal narrative, telling our stories. Converging these, the consensus, the feminist consensus, was that a woman has agency when she can discern which desires and values are truly her own, and which have been influenced by the hegemonic society. Keep the former, discard the latter, and act accordingly. It's rather ironic then that the word agency is currently bandied about by many feminists to defend a really dehumanizing sexuality, one that promotes promiscuity, very horribly imitates the tropes of pornography, and most egregiously, in the opinion of Feminists Choosing Life of New York, justifies the killing of babies made through such encounters in the name of my body, my choice. To paraphrase Louise in her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which we have right here, why do so many women desire a sexual freedom that so obviously serves male interests? And then I would add, and then have the gall to call this feminist agency. So today we will use our old school form of agency, the original definition, to push back against a culture that serves few, abuses many, and leaves all of us longing for true intimacy. To that end, I'm delighted to have Louise and Helen here to respond to a series of questions on these and related topics. Okay, the questions will always be for both of you, unless I say specifically this is for Louise or for Helen. So first question. What I personally love about FCLNY is that we are both pro-woman and pro-life. And our definition of feminism is rooted in the 19th century suffragists who believed that a woman's difference was the very basis of her strength. We also believe, in the same vein, that current mainstream feminism is fake feminism, a grotesque parody of what the media presents to us as masculine sexual freedom and economic power. So could each of you define feminism for us and talk about your relationship to mainstream feminism? Louise, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, Alicia. I mean, I tend to say that I tend to have a Catholic with a small c kind of definition of feminism. I think that it's possible to incorporate all sorts of different ideologies under the same banner, and I don't think the kind of squabbling about semantics that so often goes on is very helpful. I guess I would say that feminism is any kind of ideology that advocates on behalf of women, like qua women. For me, the reason that I think that feminism is important and ought to exist and ought to, I think, permanently go on existing, I don't think that there's some kind of moment where we will have defeated patriarchy or whatever, and then that will be it. I think that basically the reason that feminism needs to exist as a political movement is that there are certain important ways in which women are excluded from public life normally by virtue just of motherhood. The nature of motherhood is that you will have a period of being physically incapacitated and not able to participate in public life as a man would, as a father can. And an inevitable consequence of that is that women end up just not having as loud a voice, particularly at that stage in their lives, as men do, and also that mothers end up being disproportionately sidelined compared with women who don't become mothers. I think, therefore, that feminism has to exist to counteract that effect, essentially, to say that, yes, we have fewer women in boardrooms and in parliaments and all of this. It's very difficult to counteract that without, just rejecting motherhood altogether. There is an extent to which we do just have to step away, at least for a bit. And I think that what feminism does is an attempt to nevertheless boost the voices of women who are not necessarily in the room.
Great.
So, yeah.
Helen?
Sorry, my microphone was on mute. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Of course, typical Zoom meeting moment. Okay. So
your mouth is going, but no sound is coming out.
Oh, is it still? No, you can hear it, right?
No, I'm saying
okay.
typical.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay. So I will touch on the point about semantics that Louise just made. Because I am one of those people who does struggle with the semantic aspect of the term. My struggle with the term feminism is ongoing just because words have simply lost their meaning over time. And it's not just true for the word feminism itself, but for all the words that we might use to define it: equality, justice, man, woman, child, and even the very concept of rights, as Erika Bachiochi has written. So I think that this age of mass media marketing and branding is the primary reason that these terms have become buzzwords and verbal tokens that are sort of meant to signal connection with other political identifications from which I generally recoil. So I think that reclaiming the term feminism is going to mean taking on the additional work of describing in detail how it lost its meaning, when, and how basically every other word in the word bank where it lives has also been similarly subverted. And that's a lot of work, and it requires a lot of distinction making. And so, like, for political purposes, Louise is right. Like, it's not useful to, when you're having a political discussion in public, necessarily to get into the weeds on that. But people have done it very well. Once again, Erika, shout out.
Yeah.
But I will say that Mary Harrington has come up with a pithy way of reclaiming the label feminism from the regime that I think has been very effective in its own way. Her term reactionary feminism is effective primarily because it's funny, it's ironic, it's tongue-in-cheek, and it treats the liberal feminist hegemony with well-earned irreverence. And it simultaneously allows a person to reclaim the term while positioning themselves entirely outside of the moment. So if there is a label that I embrace, it's that one.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, I was thinking about that and Mary's term when I was reading Louise's book for the second time. And Louise, you told the poignant story of Josephine Butler, I think, who was woman who was working very hard in the brothels of India. Is that correct, if I remember correctly? And how she would have been termed a reactionary feminist during that time period, even though the work she was doing was actually more progressive than any other of her peers and many women today. Can you expand on that, just to build off of Helen's point?
So Josephine Butler, I think, is a real heroine in that she did the most amazing selfless work both in Britain and in India, which was of course part of the British Empire at the time, in helping women who are in prostitution, typically women who are desperately poor or had been what we would now say trafficked into prostitution, and, you know, did amazing things, took women into her home and nursed them when they died of venereal disease, you know, went into workhouses regularly and sat on the floor and picked oakum with you know, people in the workhouse. Like a really, really remarkable person was Josephine Butler, and celebrated in her day, but now, of course, condemned by many contemporary liberal feminist writers as a white savior, etc., etc. Michelle, I think you've got some background noise.
Yes, if Dorothy, whoever has Dorothy's iPhone, could put yourself on mute, that would be fabulous, Dorothy. Thank you.
Cool. And actually, there's a passage that I quote in the book when I'm writing about Josephine Butler from a contemporary British liberal feminist writer, describing her as reactionary specifically. And I when I read that, I screenshotted it and sent it to Mary and said, you know, reactionary feminism kind of spotted in the wild. I agree with Helen. It's a great term. It's very memorable, and I think it's kind of very online in a good way, in that it's playing with irony in the discourse, but it also, I think, summons up something true, which is it's not just about sort of returning to the 1950s, like that phrase which you hear so often. And remembering, of course, the 1950s was quite a strange decade in a whole bunch of ways, and there are things about the 1950s which I actually think aren't very desirable for women, like the very isolated nuclear family model and stuff like that, right? I think what reactionary feminists, to me, summons up is not just imitating a particular decade, but looking into the deep past and looking at other cultures and thinking, what are the common tropes here? Like, what are the ways that other people, assuming our ancestors were not just idiots and were not bad, you know, or the kind of progressive narrative, if we could do away with that and we say, look, people of the past and people in other parts of the world have had wisdom when it comes to dealing with exactly the issues that we're dealing with when it comes to men and women getting along, what have they come up with to deal with this? And what could we learn as this kind of very fractured culture that's actually lost touch with its past? I think that's what the Reactionary Feminist Project is. And I think it's a really exciting moment for it, because it seems that everyone wants to hear about it, wants to talk about it.
And we're all feeling that way. So I think when we read Mary's term, I you know, I know her from Twitter. I just thought, that's it. That's what I am. I'm a reactionary. I was like, someone finally termed it, you know. So Louise, you've done some amazing work for other women. Can you talk about your experiences working at a rape crisis center and how that led to your recognition that a liberal culture that is, you know, sexually no holds barred really wasn't beneficial to women in the long run?
Yeah, so I can't talk obviously about sort of specific cases I dealt with, but yeah, I working at a rape crisis center was my first job out of university. And it was very formative for me for several reasons. The main one being that I realized how poorly my women's studies degree experience actually mapped onto reality. I went straight from doing women's studies to doing this work, and it was really whiplash inducing, you know, how much of a gap there was between sort of dominant gender theory in universities, which was obviously all about pronouns and lipstick and drag and all this kind of stuff, right? Like, it just had zero relevance really to women's actual lives. It also was formative to me in the sense that I realized from kind of looking at the ground level how poorly a lot of even second wave theories of sexual violence actually mapped onto reality. I mean, so particularly the Susan Brown-Miller thesis that rape is about power, not about sex. That phrase I'm sure we've all heard. It was a phrase that I'm pretty sure I used a lot. I probably used it actually in, you know, one of my jobs was going into schools and teaching consent workshops and stuff, and kids can ask really good questions, and sometimes they ask these questions and they cut through the ideology, and you think, yeah, you're right, that doesn't really explain, you know, what we actually see in real life. The main way in which I now have departed from sort of orthodox radical feminism is that I don't think that evolution stopped at the neck up. I think that there are some really important ways in which men and women are psychologically different from one another. And I think that those are to do with our history as a species. They're not just socialized, even though socialization does have a role to play. They're not just socialized. Like, there is an extent to which we're dealing with profoundly different sexes, and those differences are not going to go away. And this whole project of seeking to kind of erase the gender binary and all this like utopian stuff, I think is doomed to failure. And I think that the task that's actually before us, if we're sort of practically minded as feminists, is to ameliorate those differences and find structures, norms, laws that reduce opportunity for rapists, you know, that encourage long-term relationships, that do all these things which are clearly pro-social, without the goal of trying to make men and women the same, because men and women are never going to be the same. We have to deal with what we've got.
No, I mean, Erika Bachiochi has a great term for it. It's not just, you know, biological asymmetry, but as you said, it's above the neck as well. And as college professor, one of the things I found particularly rich in the last 5 to 7 years. I've been teaching a class called Women in Art for nearly 20 years. And for the first 13, you know, no one gave me any pushback with regards to the word woman. In the last 5 to 7, I actually have students telling me I'm womb-centric, which the first time I heard that, I started to laugh and I thought, thank God I am, or this class wouldn't be being taught, you know, but because I cover Mary Cassatt and women who talk about women in pregnancy and female artists who have, you know, drawn images of women and children, the last few years, they don't want anything to do with it. They really want to deny their biology. And then within the next 5 minutes, they will tell you, female students in particular, how men do this and men do that. And men are like this, and I'm not like this because I'm a woman. So there's like, at the same time, this kind of fiction that they have in their heads about us being completely equal. When the inner truth comes out, it ruptures and they're right back to the very fact of difference. So
I love Mary Cassatt. My husband, my 30th birthday present from my husband was a Mary Cassatt print of a mother-child duo who looked a lot like me and my son. So
that's lovely. Yeah, the touch. You can only understand that touch in the mother in the Mary Cassatts once you've had a baby.
Yeah.
Helen, so you've got an advanced graduate degree. You've spent time working abroad and for the government. So although you never became a girl boss, certainly you were probably exposed to a lot of them. Talk about a great turn of phrase. You have two that I use all the time now, not only Girl Boss Interrupted, but an open air asylum, to describe the contemporary, you know, state of women in the public realm. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to that term and what you were thinking about when you coined it?
Sure. My time working for the federal government actually is what made it really clear for me that there is no national security threat as dangerous to America's security and longevity as our country's diminishing vital rates, which you can basically summarize as the marriage rate, the birth rate, and our death rates, and the proportion of elderly to young. And we spend this absolutely inordinate amount of money funding a military industrial complex, which is wasteful, deeply incompetent, and lacking strategy, while American families languish. And so as I was working as a Fed, I just found myself quite frustrated by this profound lack of grand strategy, and this profound neglect of the real things that are going to undo us, which are the disintegration of the American family, the decomposition of American communities, and plummeting public trust in fellow citizens as well as public institutions. So I came to the conclusion through my work that the more important work was to be done at home. And if I was ever going to make a difference, as sort of, you know, ambitious and narcissistic as that sounds, it was not going to be in that system. So anyway, that's sort of how I came to that conclusion. As for the Girl Boss Interrupted thing, that comes from the movie Girl Interrupted, which was released in 2000. It's the one with Angelina Jolie and Winona Ryder, about Claymore Asylum in the Northeast, which is a home for for girls who had sort of lost it. And there were very interesting themes in that movie. I found that so many of these women had been subject to sexual abuse, and Angelina Jolie's character was promiscuous, and that was actually cited by the therapist as one of the reasons that she was there. And then the main character was sort of made crazy by some expectations by her parents that she would enter academia in a certain way. She wasn't performing up to these standards, and she was sort of lost in this sort of the mid-century explosion of professions and ambition, and sort of the narratives about what women were supposed to be were changing, and she was sort of lost in all of that. And so GIRLBOSS Interrupted was essentially my take on taking that movie and just applying it to the current moment. But the difference is that, we don't have brick and mortar asylums anymore. It's just everybody all the time experiencing the same things, this sort of rampant sexual, honestly, I do call it abuse. There is misbehavior that people are sort of, I would say groomed into. Yep. And then you sort of emerge on the other end of it as a young woman, and there's issues with consent where you almost don't want to take responsibility for it because you don't feel like you had full knowledge of what was happening, And so I think we're just living in this cesspool of regret and sadness and pain. And on top of all of that, there is the expectation that you have to be this totally self-sufficient, independent, and just radically, I'll restate, independent economic machine. Right. And none of these, neither of these expectations, you could say, neither of these cultural norms is well suited for the female soul. Yep. And I think that the craziness that we feel is a reflection of the unnaturalness of the regime.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, I always considered myself an essentialist. I never separated the body, the mind, or the spirit from the notion of what it meant to be a woman. And for me, in 2016, I went to a conference and I was giving a paper on young women and how when you have an increasing number of female students, you should change the, bibliography, basically the reading material, to reflect more women's lives so that young artists, female artists, can figure out how to navigate motherhood and making art, how they can see where women artists throughout history have, as we talked about with Mary Cassatt, even though she herself never had children, but where they can use their lives, their experiences, their specifically female experiences, as fodder for their work. And so to just kind of cut any other, discussion of gender and construct out of the possibility in the Q&A, I had a one-sentence phrase that I just said, so when I'm talking about embodied experience here, let's just suffice it to say that, only women can get their periods and men can't have babies. Now, this was 2016 at a international conference out in Seattle. And what do you think the first question out of a male participant's mouth was? I know plenty of men who get their periods. And I think some kind of I pretty much started fluttering my eyes and, talk about the language being relative at that point. I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't believe that my entire framework for understanding women and their difference had really been hijacked by the culture at large. And the irony was in that whole entire Q&A is that everyone who was telling me what a woman is was a male presenting person. There was not one female presenting person, to use their terminology, who was actually willing to go to bat for women. So, I mean, we've got a lot of work to do. Helen, I wouldn't, say that just staying home. I thought when you said, you decided that your work at home was just as important as working for the federal government. And I think about Jackie Kennedy. And although I'm sure I'm, misremembering her exact quote, I think she said something like, you haven't accomplished much if you bungle raising your children. That is the most important thing that you have to do as a mother. So let's get back to this idea of the sexual revolution and the case that Louise and others, all of you really have made against it. So I'm a big fan of Mary Eberstadt, and both of you, as well as Christine Emba and Erika Bachiochi, who were our panelists in part one, have all written or spoken about the ramifications and the detrimental effect on not just women, but society as a whole from this radical reshifting of sexual norms in the 60s and the 70s. Could you each talk a little bit about how you think that has resulted in the type of insanity and biological sex and gender and language that we're experiencing now, but in particular, I think, Helen, you touched on this, the disintegration of women, mind, body, spirit.
I can speak to the one thing that I think has, well, it's hard to say what's hurt women most of all of this, but one thing that really stands out to me is intergenerational resentment. I think that when these norms sort of collapsed into the kind of woman who was sort of sexually uninhibited and economically available to work and maximally has the maximum utility moment in your life, that's the maiden moment, which Louise's new podcast, Maiden Mother Matriarch, sort of captures what we would have once understood a female lifespan to sort of reflect, which is that you had different phases in your life, and there was a time for, there's a time and season for everything. And so I think that what happened with this norm shifting is that idea of seasons and change and adaptation and growth and actually like a growth of honor and wisdom as time goes on really just collapsed into the image of the maiden. And that became the archetype, you could say, that became the symbol of female accomplishment, you might say. And as a result of that, I think a couple things happened. I think that the bonds between women in the later generations and that woman were severed because, there was a rejection of those later generations, those later iterations of a woman's life, a rejection that they knew something good and valuable and important that the maiden sort of image didn't perfectly encapsulate on its own. And I think that is reflected in many women's relationships with their mothers and their grandmothers. Many women that I know approach us, Louise and I both, for our work and talk about this really profound sense of alienation that they have from their own mothers. And the sort of common sentiment is, no one ever told me this. And then there's a second sort of, alienation from other women, which is the sexual competition that is introduced in a world where there are no proper sort of sexual boundaries and rules. So even within the maiden group, you could say, there's no sense of sort of custody for one another's dignity, you might say. This our aversion to slut shaming, the term is, that what that actually looks like is that women aren't taking care of one another and aren't encouraging each other to be prudent about our sexual choices. And also, I'm going to use a sort of economic term, which I typically don't like when we're talking about sex. I really sort of don't love the whole sexual marketplace idea, but there's a bit of
no, this is for me to watch. I need a vocal.
There's
And
a bit of
I need a vocal.
Let's get some lunch. Come on.
I think we've got a microphone issue maybe.
Let me try to figure out who it is.
I think it might be Tanya.
We're getting a lot of feedback from someone's phone.
Oh, there it is.
Or computer. You could mute it. Great. Go ahead, Helen. Sorry.
Anyway, no, that's okay. So what was I saying? Oh, just that I think that when you're sort of dumping women's bodies into the sexual marketplace, so to speak, in the same way that when like China dumps chicken into anybody else's market or whatever, the value of that thing goes down. It's like an intentional sort of sabotage. And so it becomes more difficult for the individual woman to retain her virginity before marriage, her chastity or whatever, because a man can go to anyone else and get what he wants.
Right.
So I think that that is another way that women have become quietly resentful and suspicious of one another, because we're in this perpetual and fierce war of all against all. And it's crazy making. Another thing that I will say connected to my old point is that I think the explosion of plastic surgery is reflective of this, the collapse of the mother and the matriarch archetypes, and that this sort of inability for women to age gracefully and maintain status and respect in the world. And that's hard. That's hard. And women don't treat other women well when they start to age, you know. So anyway.
No, those are all excellent points. In fact, in something I've been ruminating on for quite a while, because I'm in my mid-50s, so I've watched the aging process for the last 10 years amongst my peers and the choices that people have made. And I try not to judge, because I understand how invisible you've become. I mean, more invisible than you ever imagined. But what I think the biggest, resentment about is, as you said, I feel incredibly sorry for these young women whose mothers want to remain girls. And whenever an adult woman calls herself a girl, I just want to shake her and say, you are a woman. I think it's almost like stealing girlhood. It's as if they've stolen it right out from under them. And no wonder they have no connection to the female sex at all, right? Because it's been owned and possessed by the 2 generations prior to them. And they're still trying to possess what we sometimes term, the maiden years. So that's a great point. Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Louise?
Yeah, Helen mentioned the word status there. And I think that it's a word I sort of ruminate on a lot in this, because I think it is at the center of so much of what is going on. I mean, I think that the desire for status is an essential part of human beings. I don't think it's like a personal flaw. I think it's just an essential drive, right? Like we seek, if we reterm status as just the esteem of our peers, it's something that we all seek, just in different status games, different overlapping status games. And I think that I don't generally like to use the word patriarchy. I don't think it's a very useful term. I think that it has a kind of tight anthropological meaning in a society in which only men are allowed into positions of power and so forth. But we don't live in one of those anymore. We used to, but we don't anymore. Like, we don't have women officially excluded from positions of power. And I think the way that it is often used to mean this kind of amorphous way in which women always lose, I don't think is quite true. There are lots of sort of empirical ways in which you can assess that and find that not to be true. But I think often what people are talking about when they use the word patriarchy is not anything empirical, actually. It's much more painfully emotional, and it's all to do with status. It's to do with this feeling that women are just a little bit lower status than men in every way. And I think that is true. I think that women are generally regarded as a little bit lower status than men. And you can see it in things like language, the fact that we consider feminine boys to be low status, whereas masculine girls are okay. Tomboys don't get bullied anywhere near as much as sissy boys do. The way that Germaine Greer observed this many decades ago, the way that words that describe women tend over time to become negative, like tart or mistress, words like that used to be neutral over time become negative. The fact that when women enter professions en masse, like teaching, for instance, or medicine, increasingly, those professions become lower status and lower paid. I think that is true. I think that there is a kind of vague emotional way in which women are regarded as a little bit lower status than men, not necessarily despised. I don't think that our society is misogynist per se. I don't think that I think it's rare for people to hate women, for men to hate women. There are obviously true misogynists, but I don't think it's the norm. I think, though, that there is this vague way in which we are considered to be maybe a little bit infant-like, sort of lovable, but not very worthy of respect necessarily. And I think that what's going on in so much of feminism, the kind of feminism I think that we're suspicious of, is a feminism that is trying really, really hard to attain masculine status for women, recognizes this fact that women are considered lower status than men, and sees the solution to that for women to be more masculine, for women to inhabit the male role, to reject everything to do with femininity and femaleness, motherhood being absolutely top of the list. And I think that has been the great effort of the last half century, is to try and kind of shake off this feeling of humiliation almost associated with being a woman, and to try as much as possible to inhabit the male role instead. The problem with that political goal is it's completely futile. Like, it's just impossible. It's not going to happen. And no, I don't think anyone, even trans men, you notice how whenever trans women appear in newspapers, it's because they're like CEOs or, film stars or whatever. And whenever trans men appear in the newspapers, it's because they've had a baby. Like, you cannot shrug off this stuff. And I think that it's hard, but I think that an alternative feminism, maybe it's what reactionary feminism is, that tries instead to return status to women, and to actually say that there is enormous status in, say, motherhood, in being a matriarch, in female wisdom and female culture, and saying women, yes, are different from men, but that's not bad, that's a good thing. Sort of taking pride in femaleness and in femininity. I think that is a difficult project, but I think it's a far, far preferable project to the one that we've been embarked upon for the last couple of generations.
Yeah, where our sexual attractiveness and our looks are is our only currency whatsoever.
Yeah.
Absolutely losing, game. So one of the things I'd like to return to the idea of intimacy, since part 2 is all about that. So it seems that and both of you have written about this in other pieces, and you write about it in your book, Louise. There seem to be 3 major challenges to all forms of human intimacy, if we define it as the innermost knowledge of another human being and the exchange of trust that comes from that knowledge, right? I've shared with you not just my body, but my feelings, my deepest dreams and desires and fears. And so it seems to be technological, there's technology, there's pornography, and then, of course, the kind of capitalist mindset that turns every human interaction into a transaction. What advice do you have for young people dealing with the intertwining of this 3-headed beast that prevents them or precludes them from really getting to know one another and sustaining a long-term relationship? Helen, do you want?
Sure. I think there might be somebody who accidentally just turned off their mute. Kathleen Lee, maybe. Yep. Sorry. All right. Anyway. Okay. So, gosh, I think that pornography is such a scourge, it's almost hard to articulate the degree to which it degrades people's minds, hearts, and ability to interact normally, even let alone positively with one another. It's something that I think that women should talk openly about with men that they're sort of screening as they're dating, which is, I guess, in itself a bit of a step beyond what people are doing now, Well, okay, so let's start with, let's date with a purpose. let's meet people with a purpose. And perhaps even, so I'm coming from the Catholic perspective. And so, but if I'm talking to, so I could talk about that, but if we're talking to like your average kind of secular person without, freaking them out, with, too intense an evangelism here, I would just say you need to start with a basic confidence and belief that, as you mentioned that billboard in the beginning, a basic confidence and a belief that you deserve better than this culture and these behaviors, which are so obviously degrading and viscerally repulsive. You can feel it. Louise, it's what Louise sort of talks about as the inner voice. This is something that is natural to people. And I really think unless they've had really serious trauma that has completely silenced that inner voice or divorced them from it psychologically, I think you can tap into it. It's just a sort of basic feeling. Okay, so start with that. And then the next step would be introduce purpose into your interactions with other people. Well, specifically, we're talking about women dating men now. So introduce purpose to your dating life. Date with the intention, if you're still too afraid to talk about marriage or acknowledge that you want that, at least date with the intention of a serious, committed relationship, okay? And in that dating process, I think that talking about pornography is one of the first things that women should do with men. And it doesn't need to be, I don't think it needs to be accusatory. I think that's totally counterproductive. I don't think it needs to be angry or overly upsetting, but it can be a very simple standard that you set, that I consider this unfaithfulness. And I can't be with somebody who engages in this. Plain and simple, clear statement of expectations. I think that would be sort of my most dressed down, basic secular advice for people trying to sort of navigate this world. I'm not sure if I actually answered the question.
Yeah,
but
no, you most definitely did. It was definitely practical advice. I mean, I think that's what they're looking for, because as you said, they've been abandoned by the lineage of the matriarch and the mother that I think in some cases didn't even know that it felt uncomfortable counseling, I should say, because the culture had convinced them otherwise. I know that I was in my 40s when I first heard my mother say the memorare, and she's always been a devout Catholic, and I've asked her to pray for me since I was capable of understanding that was, intercessionary prayer was something you could do. And when I first heard her say the memorare, I said, how come you've never taught me that prayer? And she said, oh, I just always felt like she didn't really have an answer, but I knew it was because she felt that she wasn't making me into this strong, young feminist, this potential, even though in the 70s there was no term for it, this girl boss, this Billie Jean King, right? This kind of, future worker bee, and the idea of the mother was something she wasn't comfortable passing on. So I think they need this advice. I think your advice is practical, and I think it's great. So I think you totally answered the question. Louise, do you have any, what would you tell people about these kinds of challenges that face them, the pornography, the technology, the lack of intimacy because every interaction is made transactional?
I've included quite a lot of practical advice in my book.
Yes, I love it right at the end. Advice, and it's advice what you would give a daughter. So again,
I didn't initially have that in the book. Initially, the book was just a sort of straightforward cultural criticism kind of thing. And then I felt as I was going on, like there was this big gap because I wasn't saying it. And I have so many emails from people all the time asking for practical input like this. And I felt a little bit embarrassed about it, making sort of putting self-help into an otherwise serious political book. But then I reasoned that actually, look, this is serious political stuff. And actually people forming their relationships and having children and building families. I mean, it was like what Helen was saying earlier. This is absolutely fundamental to society, to to the nation. Like it's the fundamental building blocks of what a society is. And if you're not doing that effectively, then what are you doing? You know, you've fallen at the first hurdle. So yeah, I have a bunch of practical advice which I summarize in the last chapter. Some of it has been very controversial. I went on breakfast TV early on in book publicity and was grilled about one of my pieces of advice, which is don't get drunk with men you don't know.
Yeah.
Which what was interesting about it was that the TV presenters were really outraged, and I've had other people who've been really outraged and said, you know, I've been accused of sort of wanting women to live as if they live in Saudi Arabia, like that level of kind of backlash.
Reactionary feminist. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. But then that's not been the response generally from readers and listeners. You know, overwhelmingly comments and feedback and whatever is like, yeah, duh. And that this was actually considered to be incredibly mainstream view, even in the 1990s, 1980s. I mean, I think we forget how quickly things have changed. Things like if you look at, say, rates of stay-at-home mums, the proportion of women who are stay-at-home mums in even the 1990s, it's so much higher than it is now. You look at the age of average first marriage in the 1990s, so much lower than it is now. I mean, I think that we aren't always cognizant of quite how much things have changed in only 20 or 30 years. And the advice that I include in the back of the book is so vanilla, right? Like if you're looking at it in that context, I mean, the final title of my conclusion is Listen to Your Mother. It's not obey your mother, crucially, it's listen to your mother. It's like give your mother the time of day, like, you know, hear out what she's got to say. And that in a way is the unifying piece of advice, because actually this stuff is really obvious, and it's basically stuff that every generation of women has known more or less and has told their daughters and their granddaughters more or less. What's unique about our situation right now is that we don't have that cross-generational dialogue. And actually, if anything, the whole progressive narrative, this idea of everything just kind of getting better and better and everyone getting more, woke is in the original use of the term, over generations, is that it means that kind of definitionally you think your mother and your grandmother have nothing to say.
Yeah.
Because they're old and they're out of touch and they don't get it. When of course these women, one, have lived it already and have generally accumulated wisdom through life experience and through seeing other women's lives play out and so on. And two, these are the women who love you most in the world. Like the editors of Cosmo magazine do not care about you. They don't love you, they don't know you, you know, whereas your mother, obviously barring abuse, barring really bad maternal relationships and whatever, but if there is a single person in the universe who is likely to have your best interests at heart, it is your mother. And yet this whole idea of listen to your mother is it's been, I mean, the fact that well, look, when I chose the chapter titles, all the chapter titles are basically kind of obvious statements, things like men and women are different, sex should be taken seriously, listen to your mother, whatever. People are not products. What I did this deliberately to be a bit cheeky, that I chose them knowing that some people would think they were obvious and some people would think they were outrageous.
Right.
And basically, no, there will be no one in between. Like those are basically your options. And that is indeed how it's played out. I mean, when the contents page was not leaked, but shared on Twitter, even a few months before publication, it went completely wild because it triggered that exact response, that there were people who thought that it was completely outrageous and that I was basically a fascist. And then there were people who couldn't understand what the problem was. And it ended up being a kind of Rorschach test politically. But that's the moment that we're in, where actually obvious stuff that everyone pretty much who's ever lived before us has thought is in some quarters insanely outrageous. So yeah, so basically the advice is simple and obvious, but no one's saying it.
Yeah, for fear of sounding like a scold or old-fashioned or out of touch. That's also hanging on to the role of the maiden, right? Not willing to step up and be the mother or the grandmother. One question that I'd really like to get both of your takes on is the kind of nihilism we dwell within. I think, of course, the refusal to listen to the mother is also very typical of a culture that's very ahistorical, right? Because your mother is your history, your grandmother is your history, it's your lineage, it's your past. And we don't like history right now either. That's very inconvenient. But I also, as a mother myself of college students and college professor, I have a lot of empathy for my students being surrounded by the meme of suicide and the nihilism. And I recently heard on Twitter, the term body count to describe the number of people that you've slept with, and which in many ways is completely appropriate for so many reasons, because if these are one night stands and hookups, casual hookups, you see them once, and then you die to them, literally you ghost them, right? And Louise, you talk about the death grip syndrome in your book about men who masturbate to porn too often and then are completely desensitized. So, obviously at Feminists Choosing Life of New York, we think a lot about how a culture that believes it can freely extinguish life at its earliest stages, right? From conception to, at least in New York State now, right up until the moment the child comes out of the womb, and increasingly in many other states. How does that kind of mindset lead to the entire soup that we're swimming in right now? The cultural nihilism, the obsession with death. Could you both talk about that?
Louise, do you want to go first, or?
No, you go ahead. I've just had a long diatribe.
So I think that this nihilism comes from a fundamental view of the human person that boils down to visibility and utility. And basically, if you don't check both of those boxes rather aggressively, you're not human enough. Mm-hmm. This is true for this is the lens that blinds us from the reality of life in the womb. We can't see, and they're not useful to us. Mm-hmm. And so they don't count, they don't matter, we get to kill them. But if that's how we view human life in its most nascent stages, it doesn't matter. Like, there's nothing fundamentally that can distinguish that from a person who is living out in the world. And I think that this is just, there is a straight line between that and, let's see, what else? The way that we treat postpartum women. They're invisible and they're not useful to anybody but their baby. And I think there's a general sort of disregard for them. I think that postpartum anxiety and depression is a huge problem that people can't talk. I mean, there was a horrible, horrible case of this woman in, I think it was outside of Boston recently, who murdered her 3 children.
Yeah, she was
tried to kill herself.
Psychiatric drugs, right?
Yes, 13 psychiatric medications in the span of 10 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, terrifying.
It's like, it's demonic, for lack of a better word, So anyway, but there was something missing in the culture. There's something missing there that would let that woman fall through the cracks in that way. And I'm not trying to absolve her of this is all beyond me. I'm not making judgments one way or another, but I'm just saying that I think that that case is really indicative of a wider problem of the culture's tendency to disregard people who are really, really vulnerable. There are other categories of people that come to mind immediately: the disabled, who now we are neutering in the womb, of course, if they test for the wrong number of chromosomes before, in these tests that are actually wrong a lot of the time. But next step, the elderly. Yeah. And Louise and I have talked about this on my podcast, how this really dehumanized view of other people is leading us to the normalization of euthanasia, and how these terribly atomized, older, lonely people who have no one and can offer nothing to the greater economy, we're just going to kill them. Like, that's just going to be what the society comes to if we continue along the current track, because there's nothing that's grounding us in a higher reality. There's nothing that we've really rejected the notion the reality of the human soul. Yeah, that's my view.
Thank you. Louise, do you have any thoughts about nihilism and medical assistance in dying? That's what the new bill in New York State is called, a very kind of dispassionate, objective, clinical term, medical assistance in dying. MAID.
Yeah, it's very, Orwellian is overused, obviously, as a
Yeah.
term, but I think there are a few examples, better examples of the sanitizing of language described in 1984 than something like MAID, which has really been killed by the state, right? That's what's actually going on. I actually have a big piece in First Things coming out soon about MAID partly, and also about abortion. I mean, my position on abortion is that I'm not Catholic. I'm kind of agnostic Christian. I think I hold roughly the modal view among most voters, which is kind of the earlier the better, and some abortions are better than others. And I basically have a slightly squeamish sort of agnostic view. I use that advisedly because I think that what's going on when people talk about abortion, what we're actually talking about is whether or not this should remain a Christian society. Like that's the reason it's as painful a debate as it is, because one of the very first interventions of Christian emperors in ancient Rome was to ban abortion and ban infanticide, because of course ancient Romans see them as continuous. Most cultures see them as roughly continuous. We are somewhat peculiar in generally abortion being generally considered to be morally acceptable by many people, but infanticide emphatically not being. Most cultures don't see it that way. Most cultures see it on a kind of chronological continuum and permissible according to roughly the same moral calculus. What we are moving towards, though, with MAID is the legalization once more of infanticide. This has been discussed within the Canadian Parliament. It is clearly on the agenda. 2016 only was when MAID was first introduced, and initially it was for people only with terminal illnesses. Now, as of I think next month, it's going to be available for people with mental health issues. The age limit is being lowered. Like, it is this amazing slippery slope, like right in action before our eyes. It's acting so quickly. I think that infanticide is very likely to be eventually included within that. And I think it is a really, really bright line, because it is a very fundamental Christian idea that infanticide is unforgivable. And it was a very unforgivable is, of course, the wrong one in Christian context, that infanticide is wrong. And it was one of, the earliest Christians touring Roman rubbish heaps and recovering abandoned infants. We've essentially had almost 2 millennia of this moral system reigning in an institutional way, obviously being often disregarded, of people being as fallible as they are. There have obviously been a lot of abortions and infanticides committed in Christian cultures, but the official line was no.
Right.
And I think we seem to be coming to the end of that, sort of the reign of that moral system. And my view, as someone who has complicated feelings about this, is that I don't think that most feminists who are pro-abortion have really thought this through. I don't think they realize the fact that the reason that Christians are so anti-abortion, the reasons that Christians are so anti-infanticide, is because Christianity has has an almost unique, regards the weak as precious in a way that most cultures and religious systems don't, and actually sees smallness and weakness and humility as the greatest virtues. Christians are quite unusual in seeing the world in that way, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why I argue that feminism is an outgrowth of Christianity, because actually the whole, women are smaller and weaker than men. That's just the fact of it. We can't pretend otherwise. We are inherently smaller. We are made physically vulnerable by pregnancy and breastfeeding. That's just the truth of it. And actually, the reason that feminism has the kind of moral power that it does is because it's kind of appealing to this Christian idea of protecting and valuing weakness. And I don't think it's possible to hold to that idea to cling on to that essential Christian idea without eventually reaching the conclusion that actually unborn children are also worthy of that same kind of value and protection. All of which is to say that I think that in a sense, pro-choice feminism, at least in its more kind of aggressive formulations,
Right.
the unborn child is just a parasite kind of rhetoric.
Pregnancy is a disease, inconvenience.
Yeah, that manifestation of it, not the sort of, sometimes there are really difficult choices to be made. Some abortions are tragic but necessary, not that, but the really extreme kind of stuff. I think that is soaring at the branch on which feminism sits, because actually, if you cast off that idea of smallness and vulnerability being precious, women are next.
Absolutely.
And I think that if we repaganize, and if we go back to the moral system that existed before Christianity entered the world, I think that is a disaster for women.
Yeah.
And for a whole bunch of other people as well. But women are top of the list.
I mean, Carol Crossett, who is our president and our founder, our vice president, Cecilia Lester, and I just told her to read Renée Girard when she goes on her holiday, and she's nearly 80. So you can imagine what a vigorous, amazing person she is if she's interested in reading Girard, who everyone else is reading right now. But I'm thinking too about how the culture has been so skillful in turning around the idea of the victim right now, where somehow the strongest are perceived as the weakest based on a set of tenuous, not really, valid qualifiers, shall I say. And so I hope, your words are very hopeful, Louise, but sometimes I wonder if the media itself isn't so skilled at, as Helen originally brought up, making the weakest of us not useful and not visible, that then we have no place at all. So are we going to do Q&A now? I've got my helpers here. Do you want to do Q&A, or do we have
20 minutes? So we've only got a couple questions so far from you.
Okay, I have one question that I brought up at part one that I would love to ask both of you. And one thing I do adore about feminism, aside from many other things, I have never divested myself of the label. In fact, Helen, I have to tell you something funny. I have a 19-year-old daughter, and I was driving her back to Loyola about a month ago. We were listening to one of your podcasts, and she pithily said to me about halfway through, I won't tell you who it was you were interviewing, because that would give it away, but she turned it off for a second and looked at me and said, does this woman realize that without feminism, she probably wouldn't have a podcast? I said, very good point. So even my daughter, who sometimes falls into the cultural problem of wanting to, put the hand up to the mother and say, I'm not interested in your ideas, was willing to say, okay, feminism is good to some extent. And we'd be hypocritical to say that it's not. But, as a feminist, I not only endeavored to raise a strong but kind man, but to be sensitive to the ways in which we gloss over men's needs. Louise, you talk about this, how do we raise dads, not cads? So I have a 22-year-old son, and about 6-7 years ago, he went to this program at Boston College called Agape Latte. And he went with about 5 of his best buddies at the Jesuit high school that he went to here in Rochester. And I went to pick them up. And on the way home, we were talking, and my son said, Mom, do you know about the word agape? Do you know that there's like more than one kind of love? And I really get choked up when I recall this memory, because I thought, as I told Erika at part one of this symposia, I said, I felt like a really terrible mother that by 16, I had somehow just assumed he would, get this knowledge somewhere along the way. And I said, I know about, agape, and I know about pragma, and I know about philia, and we've talked about this here at FCLNY. We find a lot of sadness in the fact that, in a secular culture, why can't we resuscitate some of these classical virtues so as to not scare people off with religion or, virtue as a kind of, term that everyone shies away from. and the notion of platonic love and all of those different kinds of loves instead of only eros. I feel like young people today only think there's eros, so they mistake the love they have for a friend for erotic love when it simply might be, you know, brotherly love or sisterly love. Or can you talk about how we could maybe bring back some of the classical ideas to appease or at least slow us down on this descent? Is that possible?
I recognize what you're saying, and I think that kids get really confused now. Well, I think the resuscitation of single-sex spaces is really important, so that kids can experience friendship, and, you know, with friendship between women is different than friendship between men. And I think that with the collapse of single-sex spaces, we also saw essentially like the collapse of those friendships and this sort of insinuation that any kind of intimacy between, especially between men, is automatically homoerotic.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I actually think ends up not just confusing some men into thinking they're gay when they're not, but turning men who are straight off of the idea of having friends. So that's a big problem, you know. And so I think, practically speaking, we really need to get back into some single sex spaces. I believe in single sex education. And I think that that's really a first step. Of course, at this point, I think we're kind of well on our way there, because the trans movement is forcing us into really acknowledging and reaffirming these boundaries. So that might be a blessing in disguise. But yeah, that's my take on that.
Great, thank you. Louise?
I guess I'm hopeful in the sense that these books extolling classical virtues are not going anywhere. You know, even like book burning efforts are not going to erase them from our culture. And if anything, the internet makes them much more available. And I think that there's a lot of hope actually in terms of how the culture is, well, it's not entirely a hopeful story, but people do have access to this to this wisdom. And actually it's like enormously easier now to access this wisdom than it ever has been. People clearly have a huge appetite for it. You know, you look at the success of, say, Jordan Peterson, for instance, who is all about extolling classical virtues and, you know, delving into the deep past for moral wisdom. And he is one of the most popular writers, podcasters in the world. So clearly, and people are willing to listen to extremely difficult, long form discussions and lectures about these topics in their millions. Yeah. So I'm not entirely hopeless on that point. I mean, there's probably a whole other session to be had about education. I completely agree with Helen about single sex education being really valuable, but also the extent to which progressive ideas have completely captured education across the Western world is clearly a problem. And there's this big question to be faced about what do we do as people who might be critical of those ideas. Do you opt out? Do you homeschool? Is that really practically possible? Is it possible to have an alternative educational institutions that offer something else? I don't know. I mean, this is all to be hashed out in the coming decades. Yeah. Because obviously the schools are such important vehicles of indoctrination, but like not in a bad way. Like that, like the nature of having, one of the great joys of having children is that you get to indoctrinate them. It sounds really, you know, like it's not generally a positive, a word that's seen positively, but actually getting to kind of offer moral instruction and education to your children is one of the great joys of having them. And of course, schools are, that's the task that schools are set that schools are supposed to fulfill, they're not doing so very well, I would say, most of them now.
Yeah. Fabulous. So we have some questions from the audience. So I'm just going to pick one here, and either of you feel free to speak to it or both. Oh, this is for both, actually. Can you both speak to the illusion of autonomy, considering you both reference the profound impact on everyone through established cultural norms? So can you both speak to the illusion of autonomy, that we are, self-defining agents, considering you both reference the profound impact on everyone of established cultural norms?
I'm happy to take that one first if you, I don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Louise.
I think we all have so much less autonomy than we think. So one of the things that I get sometimes criticized for my writing is that I'm sort of understating female agency, to which I say I'm understating everyone's agency. This isn't like just a women thing. We are such pliable social subjects as human beings. That is just the nature of being a person. And I think if no one has gone through the process of conforming to whatever prevailing view in one's peer group and then later realizing how wrong you were, if you've not gone through that process, it's because you've never realized how wrong you were, right? Like going through multiple cycles of that is necessary as part of your development as a person. And I think a certain dose of humility is necessary. And I say this for myself as well. There are probably things I'm wrong about right now, and I don't know it because I'm, just kind of riding the cultural waves as we all do. But this idea that comes out of liberalism, that you are absolutely right about everything all the time. You're absolutely right about what you want and need as a person, what is good for you. Like, no, you're not. No one is. This is the reason that we have social guardrails and we have cross-generational dialogue, because particularly as teenagers, my goodness, we have basically no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I echo what Louise has said. I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I don't think humility is very high on the list of contemporary virtues, though, unfortunately, right? I don't think it's self-questioning is really something people are taught to do. You have to have confidence as you go forward in this world today, and that usually means not looking at yourself very closely. I like this idea, though, Louise, because I think, what I realized at the age of 56 is everything that I thought was, that was sold to me as liberation was actually degradation, really. I mean, I can really say that now, and I think that sometimes the cultural subjects that are deemed the smartest, we score well on the SATs, we get good grades at school, we're really good parrots, we're really good, we're great.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I think I finally, canceled my subscription to the New York Times at the age of 47 after reading it nearly 30 years and realizing they had none of my interests. They weren't, as you said, the editors of Cosmo are not looking out for me. And I finally had to realize that, every time I looked at the real estate section and every house was over $2 million, that the New York Times was not catering to what I needed as a middle-class mother, but yet I had parroted every single one of their political policies for the last, 25 years of my adult life. So, you make great points about that. Okay, so this is a really interesting one, and I think actually Mary Harrington, speaking of which, has on her new Substack or Unheard today an article about Madonna's face, and this is about Madonna's face. So this is from Kalina or Kalina. She says, Madonna was criticized at the Grammys for the way her face looks because she has chosen to have work done. She was criticized in the 2000s for being grotesquely muscular. If feminism is the grounds for female agency, who are we to wish women would just age gracefully? I don't think we ought to critique women who are in their own choice to alter their bodies. Why can't women do what they want in the face of a system aimed at controlling every part of us? Great question. Tough one, anyways, I'd say. Talk about social, and pressure, right? The relentless cultural pressure.
Right. Could you repeat the last part of that question, please?
Yep. So Madonna's face, she was criticized recently for her face. She was criticized in the 2000s for being grotesquely muscular. If feminism is the grounds for female agency, who are we to wish women would just age gracefully? I don't think we should critique women who are in their own choice to alter their bodies. Why can't we do what we want, or women do what we want, in the face of a system aimed at controlling every other part of us?
It's a good question. I think, though, that agency isn't a cover for criticism. I mean, just because somebody's making choices doesn't make them the right choices. We can acknowledge that, you know, agency is occurring. She's expressing her agency, but make legitimate value judgments and moral judgments on those decisions. So I guess that's the first thing. But I think that specifically, I really struggle with this plastic surgery thing too, because there's a huge part of it that's just like, well, as we've expressed, the state of society as it is, if you want to retain your value, there's this, especially as a media personality, there's a certain amount of this that almost becomes, or at the very least feels necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's difficult to criticize somebody for simply, doing what needs to be done to continue existing in this way. But it certainly has this, I think that it's a bit of a precursor to transhumanism,
Okay.
And I think that it's to sort of bring back humility as a virtue. I think there are good things about humbling ourselves to accept our bodies the way that they're created, and to deal with our bodies and respect them in that way. I don't know. It's a complicated question, but there's also this other thing that when women start to do this stuff, they get into this very uncanny valley where their face isn't recognizable to the people around them, and it's actually kind of damaging to relationships. I mean, that's not necessarily like the reason why it's morally wrong. I'm not even saying it's morally wrong, but I think that I don't think that just because it's a choice that she made, that it's an uncriticizable choice.
Yeah. Well, interesting. You said uncanny valley. What I also think about sometimes it is again an erasure of lineage and history. Your face looks like the people who came before you, and it connects you to your family, and it connects you to an archetype, right?
Right. It reflects that inability for women to, it's not just about physically aging, it's about advancing through these stages of life that maybe aging is a superficial reflection of what's happening. But it really, I think it damages women behind you. It sort of damages women down the line, because it enforces this capitalistic, you might say, pressure to remain young, maximally useful, and maximally hot forever. So it's not a service to other women.
Yeah, what you said about the only currency is to be both useful and visible, and that relates directly to the unborn child in the womb, which is great. So there is that link, right? That those will always be our currency. It's fabulous. Louise, we've got about 10 minutes till the symposia is over. So Louise, this one is directly for you from Magdalene. Mm-hmm. And she says she's an agnostic guest. Do you think there is a path forward to infuse the values in your book in our culture without religion?
$1 million question. I don't know. I mean, I've been very heavily influenced by Tom Holland's writing on Christianity. He wrote this marvelous best-selling book, Dominion, and I completely buy his thesis that Christianity continues to infuse so much of modern Western life, morality, symbolism, everything, and that we are still living in the shadow of Christianity. Although I think, as we discussed earlier, that we're accelerating towards a de-Christianization process. The question is, and I tend to be pessimistic about this, whether it's possible to sort of sustain the Christian morality without anything upstairs, without actually holding to the theology.
Yeah.
Which, as I say, like I don't. So I'm, you know, I'm a cultural Christian, but I wasn't raised, you know, explicitly Christian, and I struggle a lot with doubt. I think on a personal level, I'm capable of still holding to Christian morality without having anything upstairs, but I don't know if we can as a culture. And I think that what we're seeing right now suggests that probably we can't actually, that the theology falls first, but then everything else falls eventually as well. So, I mean, one thing on the horizon for us as not just in the West, but worldwide, is birth rates, which I think Helen mentioned briefly earlier. Religious people have so many more babies. It's basically the best predictor of how many babies you'll have is whether you hold religious faith, whatever religious faith it is. Secular people have so few children, like are so far below replacement. What is quite likely to happen if this continues, given that religiosity seems to be heritable, is that we will end up with the religious inheriting the earth, and there being a much greater preponderance of people who are kind of inclined towards religiosity. That's quite a likely outcome as time goes by, but we've got a lot of other pain to get through on the way to that, because we have this incredible demographic imbalance, and a lot of elderly people who can't work, and not enough taxpayers to support them. And this is actually the subject of my next book that I've decided to call it The Case for Having Kids.
Great.
Because I think this is one of the it's the great political problem of our times and social problem. And it may be that what ends up happening is that secular liberalism is self-limiting, because for whatever reason it seems to discourage people from reproducing. But I don't know, because it's an enormous social change that I think we're all about to go through, and it's hard to predict exactly what the results will be long term. Yeah.
Great. Not the great. I mean, I don't. Pessimistic point of view isn't great, but
yeah.
So we're going to wrap up within the next few minutes. Michelle would like to say a few closing words. So we do have one more question, and we'd like both of your takes on it. So this again is from the audience. It says, lots of people, both men and women, take a sex positive view of pornography, casual sex relationships, including hookups, and agency. These people argue that because it is positive, there is no downside. Do you see a downside to that, this argument of sex positive with regards to the casual sex culture and hookup culture, and we're living in, you know, the Tinder culture?
I think this actually gets back to the question that I just answered about Madonna, which is this sort of tendency in liberal feminism, which some people call choice feminism, to recognize choice itself, optionality itself, agency itself as the highest good. And it is not. Goodness is the highest good. So there are a litany of virtues that are actual virtues, and choice is not one of them. Choice is just the vehicle to get to those virtues. But if you're using your agency to do bad things, that can't simply be honored because you're exercising your agency, and that's a good in and of itself. That's totally incoherent. But this is what sex positivity is meant to express and cover, that simply the fact of choice and the fact of consent leading to any particular sexual act baptizes that act, makes it good, makes it uncriticizable. this and that. And that's just simply not true. There are proper and improper ways to engage in sexual intercourse. You know, we're at the point now in a society where there are vocal and active people who are trying to lower the age of consent to prepubescent ages. That is wrong. We can all agree that that is a morally wrong, disgusting manner of sexual intercourse happening. You know, that's another, you know, historically we've called that rape, but we're trying to baptize it now under this sort of
marketplace of choice.
Yes, exactly.
It turns me on, so it shouldn't offend you, etc. Which is
right.
Marketplace. It's really marketplace language.
Precisely. And I you know, I find that personally offensive, but also it's just completely politically incoherent. So that's what that is to me.
Great. Louise?
I wrote 60,000 words on the topic, so it's quite hard to summarize in a couple of minutes. I think that casual sex culture is a particularly bad deal for women. I don't think it's great for men either in the long term, but I think in the short term, it's really bad for women because of the nature of sexual asymmetry. Women are smaller and weaker than men. We're more vulnerable to violence. We also get pregnant. We are the ones who deal with the consequences of an unexpected pregnancy. Men, particularly post legalization of abortion, can rip and run without really any consequences at all. Women also seem to enjoy casual sex a lot less, and actually scratch the surface and you will find a lot of women who are telling themselves sort of comforting stories about how much they enjoy it and how much they choose it and who are actually having a miserable time. You know, get women drunk and ask them and they'll tell you like this is how they actually feel about what's going on. And it's very, very common for women to travel that journey of you know, telling themselves this is okay, I'm choosing this is good for me, and then coming out the other side and thinking the opposite. I have yet to come across a woman who's done the opposite journey. Like, it's always in that direction in my experience. And it's because we are vulnerable to our culture environments. And if this is the story, if this is, you know, if the goal is to achieve masculine status by having sex like men, then women are going to try and do that, and they're going to then be competing against each other, and they're going to be sort of responding to male expectations, and they're going to get stuck in this really painful spot that we're in right now. And I think that the only way really of getting out of it is for women to become more confident gatekeepers, and for women to say that they're not going to go along with this. And once enough of them start doing that, then the culture starts to change. So that's a big part of the reason I wrote the book, in the hope that women would become more confident gatekeepers. And the emails that I've had from lots of young women and their mums suggest that that is happening, at least at a small scale, and hopefully it will become larger over time.